be talking about improving treatment of metastatic cancer through game theory. Katerina is expert in dynamic games, especially evolutionary games, I would say, and she did a lot of applications in different areas. One of them is medicine. There is a large group nowadays working in this area, no, of evolutionary games in medicine, or?
Well, we hope so. Yeah, it's expanding.
Expanding. Okay, so the floor is yours, Katerina. And as I said, we have 1 hour in total. So let me just mention that the seminar is recorded. So if you wish to switch off your camera, please feel free. Not Katerina, but the others. So it's up to you. Okay, so again, thank you, Katerina, for accepting our invitation. And please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. So I'm happy to talk about my research and research of my colleagues on game theory of cancer and its treatment. And indeed, I come from Maastricht University, where I coordinate the team Dynamic Game Theory. So this talk is going to be about joint work of me and my colleagues, and also collaborators from the Moffitt Cancer Center and other collaborators within various projects. What I wanted to say as well, I have 45 slides, but I am planning to skip some of them if I am too slow, so don't worry. And if you have any questions, then please ask me on the slide. You don't need to wait until the end. So I will start with the motivation for this research, which is the current standard of care in metastatic cancers. So typically, metastatic cancer means it's a cancer which is not anymore on its initial site, but has already spread somewhere else. So what is being done currently against these cancers is that you basically use either a drug or a drug combination at the maximum tolerable dose, which is calculated such that that's the maximum dose the patient can really take. And it's either done continuously or in repeated identical cycles, which you actually decide a priori. And then what you do, you are trying to understand whether the tumor volume is increasing or decreasing. And basically this regimen continues until there is an unacceptable toxicity, or until you really see that the tumor volume has really increased above the value before you started your treatment. And of course, what we are missing here is until the patient is cured, but this happens quite rarely in the advanced cancers. There are advantages. So this is again sort of like the picture representation of the treatment. So it's really, again, it's really sort of the war. We are really trying to kill them with as much arsenal as we can. However, what is interesting, although we really invested a huge amount of money into new treatments, you know, every year there is somebody getting a Nobel Prize for a new treatment strategy, new drug, actually, to be more specific. Then typically we see that the tumors initially respond and then they grow again, and we sort of lose this game against cancer. So that sort of was the motivation for this research. And what I'm going to talk about is game theory of metastatic cancer, or maybe of cancer in general. Then if I introduce a rational player to this game, the physician, how it will change. If it is not changed now, how can I change it by rationality of this player? And then basically, yeah, I will conclude with some, I missed here, I think, conclusions. Maybe this should be switched. It's good that I said not necessarily in this order. So I will conclude and I will maybe talk about some open issues as well. And throughout this talk, I will talk mostly about metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. And this is a physician working on this type of cancer at the Moffitt Cancer Center, with whom I collaborate with in a few projects. And basically, if you look on the patients, this is, so in this picture, you can see that actually all the black areas, those are metastases. And this is sort of typical for this type of cancer, that once it becomes metastatic, it metastasizes into the bones and into the ribs, and it's extremely painful. So also taking biopsies from there is very difficult. So this is how they look like. And then the standard of care, even if you see that there are so many different microtumors and even bigger tumors everywhere, still we are sort of trying to cure, because we are trying to kill all these cancer cells by the maximum tolerable dose. And this is a typical picture of some of the patients. So how does the treatment look like? I'm not going to show too many of them, so I just do this one. Basically, you see the days. It could be that the patient lives with cancer for a really, really long time. And the classical treatment is basically androgen deprivation, which means that you are removing testosterone from the blood in these patients. And that's motivated by the fact that these cancer cells who started in prostate basically need testosterone to survive. And typically you can keep patients on this type of treatment for a really, really long time. And you see here, it really took it took quite some years before basically you could see that the tumor progresses. What I forgot to say, that here what we are measuring is prostate-specific antigen, which is a proxy of the tumor burden. And then basically the physician sees, okay, this is not as low as it was before. So each of these lines is some different treatment. So here I try something, I measure in these points, and I see, well, okay, there is a response, but then it again does not work after a while. So here, this is a chemotherapy. Again, you see a response that doesn't work, and that's how it goes. So I basically try some drug, I do maximum tolerable dose of it. And here, what I'm going to talk about is this last drug quite a lot, because this one should be solving it all in a way. We will talk about it in a second. And you see again that there is initial response, and at the end, the tumor grows really, really much. And the patient actually deceases, which we don't really have written here, but so that's interesting. Basically, somehow something is going wrong here. And what we already know now is that what is going wrong here is that this system we are trying to kill actually is not static. It basically evolves. So by any treatment we introduce, we are sort of changing the conditions. And if this system evolves, then it may be that by a lot of these random mutations that cancer cells have by every division, they might, by chance, come up with a resistant mechanism against the treatment. And if such a resistant mechanism is found, then basically the cells which can resist the treatment will proliferate more than the others. And as a consequence, if I do not manage to kill this enemy, these cancer cells, I am training likely the best enemy I could have, because all the cells which I did not kill are those which actually can resist the treatment which I introduced. And so if I come back to this metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer, actually I did not even go further away too much yet. Then if you look on the types of cells, cancer cells in this cancer, it's not homogeneous. So we can identify 3 different cancer cell types in the way how they actually react to the testosterone. So before we started to remove the testosterone in the blood, typically you could see that there are like 3 main types in this cancer. And those which are here blue, which we call often P+, are the ones which really need testosterone for their survival. So typically they are also very close to the bloodstream, and they are quite strong. They are reproducing the fastest actually from all these types. And then you have other types of cancer cells, which we call here TP. And those are actually cells which can produce testosterone. So somehow by the previous treatments, we managed to train the type of cells which can actually survive without testosterone, and they can produce it. And then basically relatively far away from the bloodstream, we can typically find cancer cells which are not depending on testosterone. That might be just by chance. Maybe there are not too many of them, but there will be maybe a few. They are typically the weakest ones. They grow the slowest, and they are not really like a big danger in the situation when we compare them to the growing of the other two types. So then what happens if I apply this kind of androgen deprivation? So I remove testosterone from the blood. I will definitely target the cells which actually need testosterone, but I will then create a space for those cells which actually produce testosterone to grow. And basically, I did not really solve my problem. It's just that I changed the composition of this tumor, of these tumors, actually here. And now this last drug, which I don't know if you remember in this graph, I was showing this was the last drug which actually the patient got, was abiraterone. That is a drug which should target those cancer cells which actually produce testosterone. So the idea is if I kill the red ones, then I also kill the blue ones. And those green ones are not really dangerous. But if I do that, then I actually see that the situation ends up with overpopulation of the tumor by these T- types which do not really need the testosterone. And somehow there is no targeted therapy against this type. So if this happens really quickly, the patient either really quickly progresses, or I have to use some radical chemotherapy, or the type of therapies which actually target all three of them and do not target this resistant type separately. So that's actually what we think is going on. And years ago, at the start of the project for C modeling, Ross, I think, we started to think about how to model this problem. And of course, for this group, I don't really need to say what is evolutionary game theory, but if I'm talking to people who do not hear about it yet, I nowadays say that it's probably the easiest way how to explain it is that it's a mathematical theory of Darwinian evolution, because what it studies, as opposed to classical game, is how the organisms evolve in response to other organisms and their environment in order to proliferate and survive. So we do not talk about rationality here of cancer cells, but we talk about their adaptation so that they actually proliferate and survive and outcompete the other cells or healthy or cancer cells around them. So if you look on the metastatic cancer from that perspective, then we can think of cancer cells as players who actually inherit different properties from their daughter cells. So these properties or heritable traits, adaptations are then their strategies. And then we talk about the payoffs, then this their fitness, or we can also talk about per capita growth rate of these cells. And then you can conclude that as we have players, strategies, and payoffs, then cancer is a game. The question is, of course, whether it helps us anyhow. And there are multiple lines. I think the first ones who pointed this out were Axelrod, and Pienta, but then also Gettenby and Vincent, and more recently, Basanta et al. So there are many researchers who are working on this evolutionary game theory of cancer. This is a beautiful picture of cancer cells. So the attempt here is to sort of picture that there are actually different entities which interact with each other. Typical question is, okay, why don't I have healthy cells here? I think those matter much more in the beginning, in the initial phases of cancer than actually in the advanced ones. It a bit depends on the cancer, depends on the treatment. There might be a treatment which actually introduces immune cells to the system or makes them stronger. So in such a way, also the other cells than cancer cells become the players in this game. But here that doesn't seem to be really the case. And of course, talking about modeling, this is maybe a picture which is too common in many slides, many presentations. So essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. I'm going to talk about the replicator dynamics model of this cancer, and also then about Lotka-Volterra dynamics, which is the same as equilibria as the replicator dynamics. So I will start from the replicator dynamics. So initial questions which we had were like sort of imagine that there is really the fitness matrix which we can somehow evaluate based on how well these different cell types do in pairwise experiments when they are put in petri dish each other. And as we did not really know precisely what these values are, this was really sort of naive in a way, let's say, okay, imagine that each type cannot really proliferate well if it is competing with its own type. So then let's put the diagonal 0. Obviously, we can also rescale the columns, so that's not really a problem here. But then what we asked the physician was, okay, so if I have TP cells, which sort of meets the TP cell, T plus cell, which means TP cell in the Petri dish, is it going to be better or worse for this TP cell than if it, for this T plus cell than if it would meet, for example, T minus cell? And at the end, we got some inequalities, and as we did not really know what these probabilities are, we basically just draw them from the set 0.1 until 0.6. Why not 0.3 until 0.9? Yeah, we did not know. And there were quite extensive sensitivity analysis of this later. So I'm not too worried now about it, but we can discuss that if at the end maybe, or whether this would really change much. And then basically, based on these inequalities, you would get 22 different cases, which would correspond to all possible situations, which would actually map this situation after the Lupron was introduced, so the drug which should target the cancer cells which need testosterone, but before this drug which actually targets those which produce testosterone, the TP, was introduced. So basically we would want to see what are the possible equilibria in this game, and then we also did some other analysis of this model. But so basically if you look on the replicator dynamics, then basically you end up with different cases of equilibria of ESSs, and then basically the best situation would be if at this equilibria we would have absolutely no cells which actually do not respond to the treatment anymore. Then there is some sort of neutral situation where there are some, but there are really not so many. And then there is this negative situation, which we often call non-responder, that basically there is like a high proportion of cells which would not respond to the treatment. And of course, where is this boundary? That's another discussion we could have. But basically in the next slides, I'm going to talk this, call this group the best responder, this one responder, and this one non-responder, because we will see that for these different groups, we will get different predictions of the treatment. And then in this paper, we were not so much interested in the ESS only, but also whether we can bring this game into space and somehow make it more realistic. So I'm not going to talk about this too much, but what is really interesting here is that once you introduce some sort of local interactions among these cancer cells, so this game is not now being played against the whole field, but it's going to played only with the cells in the neighborhood of its cell, of a focal cell. And we also introduced like burst death process. So these black cells here are dead cells which will occur after some generations of this game. And then we basically observe what will happen in space. We could actually see that depending on the initial situation from which we started, we will get more or less dangerous situations. So in some cases, you see that this kind of green, which are the ones which we cannot really treat, overpopulate the field. And in some others, we have actually suicide of the tumor. And so we were also looking into how to define these equilibria in this space, etc. But what really seemed to be a big drawback of the replicator equation, of course, is that we do not really have a population dynamics. So that brought us to the next. So what is maybe the biggest lesson learned here is we could observe different equilibria. They did not necessarily correspond to the non-spatial equilibria, but still we could identify these kind of three different patient types, which would be the best responder, responder, and non-responder, unless we would have these cases where actually like scenario 2 or scenario 3, where we have a zombie model where basically the tumor committed suicide. Now I hope that I can stop it. Yes. And that was actually our motivation. So basically the point is in this replicator equation, we could just actually track what would be the different frequencies or different proportions of the cells. But what is really a problem is that if I don't treat, the cancer cells kill me because they grow too fast. And if I treat too much, then the cancer cells are going to kill me because they will become completely resistant. So that's why we converted this initial replicator equation dynamics into the Lotka-Volterra competition model, where basically we will play a bit here with the treatment again, and we will be looking on its optimization. But basically, we still have these three types. Basically, the ones which do not depend on the testosterone, so those are the ones which will be resistant to any of our treatments, have certain fixed carrying capacity. But then those which actually provide the testosterone to the cancer cells which need it as a public good will basically influence the carrying capacity of the cancer cells which need testosterone. And then again, those which provide the testosterone have a fixed carrying capacity, and those are again some constants. We could also rescale it, so that's not really essential here. And then basically we can convert our fitness matrix into the competition matrix, and we will achieve a model. We will reach to the model which actually, without any treatment, with this drug, which was the last drug for the patients I was showing you, would have the same evolutionary stable strategies as actually the replicator equation I was showing you before. And now with this simple model with three equations, there were actually some interesting propositions made on the treatment, and there was even a clinical trial which was very successful based actually on this model. And now what I want to show you is, checking a bit of time, how slow I am. Okay, I'm not slow. So if I do nothing in this model, so if I simulate these three different types, and one important thing is that we changed colors a bit. So before we were we were considering this kind of weakest type as the least dangerous, so it was green, and now basically we switch colors to the red, because the red is the one which is going to kill us if we treat too much. So that's the one which doesn't need testosterone. So if we do not really treat, we will see that if we have this best responder, there were no resistant cells in the beginning, so it will stay that way. Then we have the case of the responder, where basically we see that if I don't treat, all three types are going to be present, and the one producing testosterone is the strongest. And of course, there are different, again, we had 22 cases, so this is more like a representative case of multiple situations within that group. And for the non-responder, we see that the T minus cells, so those which are resistant, will have the highest proportion at the equilibrium. But basically what will kill us is not necessarily, you see this resistant, but what will kill us is actually the fact that the tumor burden goes too high. So if I don't treat, I have to treat, that's obvious, because if I say, okay, there is a certain value I don't want to reach in this model, say 10,000, then basically that would be reached relatively quickly. So I need to treat in order to make sure that the tumor doesn't grow too fast. But on the other hand, if I kill all these cells which compete with my resistant type, it might not really be such a good idea, because then basically the red is going to overpopulate the entire tumor, and that's not maybe what I want. Okay, so now comes the leader-follower framework. So what we have been working on in the recent years is basically introducing a rational player, physician, to this game. And basically how this game goes, right? So the physician begins the game by applying some treatment. Well, most likely some cancers will die, but the survivors are going to adapt, and they will evolve resistance against this treatment. And the physician can then play again by applying additional treatments, which can be identical or they can be different from the ones they already used before. And with each new treatment, the tumor cells continue responding and adapting. Well, this is too strong statement. I should have corrected it maybe for this audience. So it is not so that we are completely sure that in every Stackelberg game, the leader can obtain a much better result when using the advantages of first move and foreseeing followers' response. But I do believe that in most cases, if the game is non-trivial, this is really going to be the case. However, even if you would have the leader which actually adjusts their strategy based on the way how the follower responds, you would still end up much better than actually if you keep playing this kind of fixed, constant strategy, no matter what's actually being the response of your follower. So that was published here. And now if we look on this game of the physician versus the cancer cells, then basically we have players. We already talked about the game of the cancer cells within each other, but now we have physician added. So this is the leader, we have the followers. Then the strategies, of course, of the physician can be therapy options, and the strategies of the cancer cells are then the therapy resistance. And the objectives for the physician, that's a good question here, what really the objective is, but we like to believe that it's patients' quality of life or prolonging their life, so some metrics of the success of the treatment. And then basically for the cancer cells, who reproduces faster is the winner, so this is the fitness as an objective. And there are two critical asymmetries, so only the physician is rational and can anticipate the future events, at least to some extent. And in contrast, the cancer cells somehow cannot really think ahead. They can only adjust to the actions already applied. They cannot really think of the future actions and the timing. So we have this unique opportunity to change the game every time when we actually introduce a new treatment. So cancer cannot do it, right? They cannot really, yeah. So I guess this is clear. And basically the idea is, can we really use the advantages of this first move and our rationality to improve treatment? So now if I look on the same model, which I was showing you before, and here I introduced the maximum tolerable dose of the treatment, then basically only situations, so here in this first panel, you will see what will happen if I actually apply the maximum tolerable dose. So if the treatment is 1, that would be the maximum tolerable dose. If it is 0, then it would be no treatment. And here we have all these 3 cases of the patients as we had before. So only situation when actually the maximum tolerable dose would work is all the time, actually, because we give it here all the time, would be only if there were actually no resistant cells at the first place. In the situations where you have responder and non-responder, you will actually observe that this will lead to the resistant cells completely taking over. And even if the patient is still alive at this moment, this is really sort of ticking bomb, because it is just a matter of time, because the patient doesn't anymore respond to the treatment which you actually apply. I'm going to skip this now because here I want to talk about equilibria, but I might come back to it if I have time at the end. And so basically, if I now take this model, how did we really introduce the treatment? We know that basically the carrying capacity of this cancer cell type, which produces testosterone, is actually influenced by our treatment, because that's what we actually attack once we introduce this drug abiraterone. So we basically what we try to now select at every moment of the time is the treatment lambda between 0 and 1. So it can be any value in between. And if it is actually at maximum, then basically the carrying capacity of the cancer cells which produce testosterone becomes very low. So here it would be 100. And if it is 0, then it will become its maximum. Of course, there are a lot of questions you might have about, is it really linear? What we know is that it's not 100% effective, but it's almost 100% effective. That's why we have this minimal carrying capacity being 100, but we don't really know whether it's linear, so that seems to be the simplest option. And then basically all other parameters are parameterized as before from competition coefficients. And then what we were looking in this paper, what we were looking for in this paper was if we would actually have different objectives of the treatment, what would be actually the optimal treatment strategy. So what we were looking for was if we would not want to really cure the patient, but actually minimize its average tumor volume. So that could be maybe equivalent to the minimizing the burden. The second one is, however, more interesting. That's if we want to minimize the tumor mass variance, meaning I do not need to necessarily cure the patient, but I would want to keep the tumor burden stable. And then the last one is if I would just want to, so here this should be X as well, I apologize. Here we see Y. If I would want to minimize basically the population of average population of these this type of cells which are resistant to my treatment. And on the top of it, we would want that we actually don't want to treat all the time, but we would want to in total treat only 20% of the time. So we basically take this from this cumulative dose, which we are using with maximum tolerable dose. We just said, okay, let's say we maximally want to treat 1/5 of that. And that becomes quite interesting because even if we lose the game, we will see some interesting patterns. So if we would want to minimize the total tumor volume of those 3 patients, you see that we fail deliberately for these 2 cases, but we fail a bit later than we would fail with the maximum tolerable dose. And for the best responder, the treatment would be treatment on, treatment off, treatment on, treatment off. And for the responder and non-responder, you see that the treatment is more aggregated in the beginning and then I stop treating. So that was in the situation where I would want to minimize the total tumor volume. If I would want to minimize the variance, so I would want to keep the tumor stable. For the best responder, I would keep a relatively similar protocol to the first case. But for all the others, I would actually either not treat or I would treat less. And you see here, we are sort of losing because you see that this resistant type is growing. Paradoxically, for non-responder, less steep than for the responder. But basically, we see that it will take, it is not as bad as with the maximum tolerable dose, first of all. And basically, what you see here is that you would really use less treatment if you would want to keep the tumor burden stable. And then in the last case where you actually want to minimize the T- density, so the density of those which are resistant to the treatment, then you would try not to treat at all. And here, if we would allow not to treat at all, we would actually not treat at all. So the patient would die because of the tumor volume and not because of this resistant type. But here we said we really have to give the 20% dose. And if we want to give the 20% dose, then I would actually try not to treat at all, and I would just treat at the end. But of course, this criteria is a bit absurd because only thing I'm caring about is how many of these resistant cells are in, and I do not really care about the total tumor volume. But what you can see is, of course, depending on the criteria, you are going to come up with a different protocol, and none of them is going to be treat all the time, because that's not really a good idea. So if I should summarize what we talked about so far in a very simple picture, it is if you apply the maximum tolerable dose, so the maximum treatment you can, the typical scenario is initially the tumor responds, but you are actually, if these gray ones are here sensitive and the red ones are resistant cells, you are going to kill all the sensitive cells, and those which do not really respond to the treatment are going to grow. And then what seems to be a good idea, if you would like sort of replay this kind of control for different time periods, then you would probably go for less dose, of course, depending on what your goal is, which is another important question. And you would probably also introduce periods with no treatment. because in these periods of no treatment, actually the sensitive cells are stronger, so they grow faster than the resistant cells. So what would you achieve by this is that if I would treat a bit less. Of course, I would have some resistant cells which will evolve, and I will kill mostly sensitive cells, but with periods with no treatment, these sensitive cells would grow back. And I can then keep the tumor under control for much longer than I would do with the maximum tolerable dose. But of course, this somehow assumes that you give up this idea that you can actually kill all cancer cells. So instead, the idea is now, okay, you will be never cancer-free, but we can keep it under control in a sense of like a chronic disease, because you get much less treatment and you will therefore have also much less side effects, which are typical for these aggressive treatments. So if we want to change the game, we should define the goal of treatment. That's something what is typically missing. So do we really want to attempt to cure the patient? So currently I'm working on modeling non-small cell lung cancer of stage 3. And there basically you can try this, treat to kill all the cancer cells. And you have about 20% chance that you will manage. Or do you think, will you go for being never cancer-free, but live with cancer, but die of completely different disease? Then include a resistant management plan. That's a term known from actually a pest management, where they came up with this idea already years ago that if you try to kill all the pests, they will actually become resistant to the pesticide. So it might be a good idea to figure out what to do if they appear and how we will really target the resistance in these cancer cells. And then another thing which is completely missing, well, not completely, that's maybe again too black and white, but typically we report successes. But what is really interesting is to look on the patients which actually, where the treatment failed. So in case that actually the intended goal of the treatment was not achieved, why did the treatment fail? So what was wrong in our sort of expectation about how these cancer cells respond to the treatment? So, and then maybe even like trying to fit the model, improve the model, and propose different treatment regimens which could have worked for these patients. I'm just checking the time. And then if we do these 3 points, actually, then what we will achieve is what we name nowadays evolutionary therapy, which is actually the therapy that anticipates and steers evolution of treatment-induced resistance in cancer cells. So there really your goal is, you know that it's going to come, and your goal is really to target it. This is an interesting paper which is written by Jessica Cunningham, who actually took the lessons learned from integrated pest management and tried to look on how could you use these lessons for integrating cancer management. So I suggest to have a look on it if you are interested in this topic, because it seems that most of the actually ideas they had decades ago could be actually applied also in the cancer field. And now there are some typical problems. Often, so here we have the situation when we have actually a perfect knowledge of what's happening inside of the tumor. So here, to keep you sharp, the resistant cells are now not red anymore, but they are orange. And here we have similar pictures we had before. It just looks a little bit complicated. So basically, what we are saying here is that with the standard of care, again, we see that the tumor grows, while actually with this kind of pausing of the treatment with the classical care in between, we can keep the tumor under control. And that will also, and then it of course depends on what are the different proportions of these cancer cells. And one of the biggest problems which we are having is it's really difficult to estimate what these proportions are inside of the patients. And they also have like multiple metastases. So how do you actually estimate this for these different metastases? And so how could you do that? So these are examples of, even if I don't really know what the tumor composition is, then we actually can somehow initially introduce some treatment, and depending on how this tumor actually reacts to this treatment, we can actually estimate what the proportions of these different cell types is. However, that somehow assumes that you have enough time to do that. So for some cancers, you do not have the time, and this is a biggest problem, that you really don't know what is the proportion of these resistant cells you try to target. So now, if I come back to the Jingsong Zhang, who is the lead physician on this prostate cancer, what was the first trial which actually used this evolutionary therapy design was that you basically apply the treatment only until you see that the tumor shrank to about 50%. And then you wait until the tumor again recovers, and then you sort of repeat this as a cycle. So if I illustrate it by the picture, so this is a standard of care. This Lupron, so androgen, this kind of first drug which targets the cells which need testosterone is applied always. But in the standard of care, you also add to it this drug which targets the cells which produce testosterone. And this is a typical situation. Basically, there is a response and then the tumor evolves. With the adaptive treatment, you actually have periods with and without treatment. And basically, you can see that you can sort of control the tumor. The problem is, of course, that this timing when you turn it on and off might vary per patient. So you have to be careful not to miss that moment. So if I look on some modeling results, so here it's a perfect model how it would look like on the cycles on the treatment and off the treatment. For real patients, it's much more messy. So you see that that it takes maybe longer for some of them. Sometimes you overshoot it, etc. And if you look on the initial results of this trial, so that was really a relatively short time after the trial started, you see that here, you see that in the red are patients which are on on treatment and off without the treatment. And you can see that there is like a huge versatility of these cycles per patient. And if you compare it to the standard of care, here only one patient progressed, and it's quite clear why. So I might discuss that if there is time for that later. And here actually here all the patients progressed, and here only one actually progressed. Then the update, which was a year later, then showed that basically the median time on the adaptive therapy to progression was 32.7 months, while in the standard of care it was 13.8 months. And on the adaptive therapy, the patients received 41%, that again varied per patient, of the standard of care dose. So that's really sort of encouraging. As a consequence, there are multiple new trials open on this type of therapies. So in melanoma, another trial in prostate, in thyroid. And now the question is, are there other strategies that this treatment on and off? So if you remember this model with 3 equations, this model has equilibria. And if you would reach this equilibria, then you would actually stay in this equilibria forever if you could actually adjust the dose which corresponds to this equilibria as well. However, with the adaptive therapy, although we sort of managed to delay the time to progression, so here we have again treatment on and treatment off cycles, we actually typically miss this equilibria. So another type of this sort of evolutionary therapy is, so first one, which Bob Gettenby proposed in 2009, was, and he did some mouse studies on that, is basically to start with maximum tolerable dose and then try to basically decrease it. And then only if the tumor responds, you will sort of, if it doesn't respond enough, you will have to, of course, stay on the same level. But if it responds, you can go a bit lower. And by that way, you can actually find the equilibria in the treatment, which corresponds then to the equilibria. But what we somehow recently noticed that it might be better, again, if you have time for that, to basically start from almost no treatment and actually adjust the treatment to increase it only if necessary. So basically keep it increasing, and if you see that the response is not fast enough, then you keep gradually increasing the dose until you actually reach the equilibria. And this is described in this recent paper in +1. So time for conclusions. I hope I convince you that the game theory can help us to design treatment protocols that anticipate and steer treatment-induced resistance in cancer cells. Sometimes treating less or not treating at all is better than actually treating with the standard of care. I showed you one of the simple evolutionary therapies which really worked in practice, and the protocol was very easy and led to better results than standard of care. That indeed leads to cancer as a chronic disease. And nowadays there's also another ideas, actually of Joe Brown and Bob Gatenby, which might lead to curing metastatic cancer, which would be somehow a little bit more dynamic strategy, where you try to actually apply doses. First dose, which really decreases the population of cancer cells, and then you apply the second, hoping that you actually kill it. And that works in some cases. And if I should actually summarize the results so far by one picture, then it would be this one. So the maximum tolerable dose promotes the resistance. If you are really a little bit smarter, you can actually keep the tumor under control. Here are the main references. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that I can take some questions.